I'm going to talk about its sort of art historical references primarily, because I figured you guys would probably have more experience with it than I do. So, how did this get built? Anybody tell me?
So they had a contest, right? With
Yes.
architects that were presenting a plan.
Mm-hmm.
And Mylan is this like young girl.
She was like a teenager, right? She was 19?
Super young.
I thought she was in grad school. She was in grad at Yale or something.
Okay.
21.
Okay. Very young.
But it is a blind contest.
Yes, they didn't know who she was. And she won with this proposal. So simple. So, yeah, no, she was an undergraduate. My notes say she was an undergraduate, not a graduate student. And so this is 1980 that she submits the proposal. And the war had only ended 5 years earlier, right? This was recent history when she did this, which is important. I think it's very easy to sort of look at the memorial and sort of see it as separated in time because it is so abstract. The jury was made up of architects and sculptors, which I think is important in terms of the selection that was made. So how are the names organized? By when they died. Sorry? Yeah. 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 So it gets bigger as the number of deaths goes up, and then they taper off. So why organize them like that? Why chronologically? Wouldn't that make it harder to find the person that you are looking for, your friend, your family member? So there is this sense, on the one hand, people disappear into the mass. At the same time, there's a sense of a very real sort of visceral physical effect of the sort of piling up of names.
And you see who they died with. You know, without the
Right.
medical, you don't know that this whole platoon of guys
We're connected.
would want to be
Yeah.
connected on this wall.
Right.
I think some that they didn't know, as opposed to like the 9/11 memorial, where they, asked all of the families, where do you want these names? Who do you want them to be by?
Mhm.
They placed them. They were able to meet every request.
Wow.
So here they,
Yeah.
they don't get it all.
No. And not everybody was happy with this. This is a work that is very contemporary. It's drawing on, say, minimalist art practices from the previous decade, where these are works that sort of reach out to the viewer physically. This idea of a sort of phenomenological experience. You're not just looking at a thing on a pedestal and reading its iconography. You are having a physical experience with it in the space. And so with minimalism, that was very abstract. It was like, yes, you're in the space with the cube, feel the cube, or the giant, steel wall. But with this, it was tied to actual loss and actual names and actual history. And it was an incredibly effective use of what had been a very abstract sort of aesthetic approach. So we can see works like Michael Heiser's Double Negative, Earthworks influencing her, this idea of making a monument by cutting into the ground, which certainly was not how it was done historically.
Yeah, the Washington Monument in the back.
Yeah, yeah. Even that polished surface where you see yourself in the object, it shows you yourself. Is again, she's drawing on these objects that had engaged this mode without any real interest in sort of communicating a specific meaning other than the experience. We also, I think it's interesting to compare it to Onkawara's work. So are you guys familiar with Onkawara? He had a project where he would send a telegram or a postcard. So he'd send a telegram to a friend every morning that said, I got up at 7:30 this morning. I might be mixing up the telegrams and the postcards, but bear with me. So the postcards would say, I woke up at 7:30 this morning. The telegram would say, I am still alive. Right? Every day. Sent one every day. He also made date paintings every day until he died, where it would be a painting, and on the canvas he would paint that day's date that he painted it every day. And this project is 1 million years past. There's also 1 million years future. So it's just this, it's a collection of books, volumes. And each page is printed with a year, right? But it's 1 million years past from the moment when they were published in 1969. And so here you have this sort of massive collection of data organized chronologically. But again, like those minimalist objects, it doesn't really mean anything except time. And here she's sort of borrowing that strategy of this sort of chronology, this built up, this sense of massiveness it produces. But she's using it with people's names and people's lives. So there is this sort of, one of the problems was that the committee was made up of people who were looking for good art, not people who were speaking for the families or for veterans. So that it was part of the problem initially. So when it was proposed, this idea that it was a scar in the earth, her identity was a problem. The nature of the monument was a problem. Now I want to talk a little bit about anti-Vietnam War politics and art. Well, I mean, part of that, the furor about it, it was heightened by the fact that the Vietnam War was a particularly controversial one. So World War II, America came back heroic, right? Like saved the day. The bad guys were so clearly and obviously the bad guys. It was really easy to draw clear moral and ethical distinctions and to feel like heroes. The Vietnam War was so much more complicated. And we're going to look at a couple of works by artists who really ask the American public to question the status of being a hero and what does it mean to be a good guy. So the first is Martha Rosler's Bringing the War Home, House Beautiful. So here we see soldiers on the right, and then here a Vietnamese person holding a naked baby, clearly in distress. But they've been put in nice American homes, right? These are images from home decorating magazines that she's from, and she's collaged in images from like Time and Life news magazines. So why would she do that? Why would you stick images from the war in these homes? Yeah.
One of the problems with the Vietnam War is that the nation wasn't mobilized or in support of it. So the soldiers are off for 365 days of a foreign tour, and everyone back home is going to college and having fun, and they're completely disconnected with the war. Whereas in World War II, we have full mobilization.
Yeah.
But we also watch the war on TV.
Yeah. Yes. This sense of, I've read descriptions from people who had this experience. I was like watching TV, and there's footage of the war and carnage, and it's awful. And then it's an ad for a refrigerator, and then an ad for spaghetti, and I'm eating my TV dinner, and it's this bizarre sort of conflation of worlds that previously had been kept separate. So it's often referred to as the living room war. Right? This sense of that what was happening overseas was being experienced at home in weirdly comfortable settings by people who are going to school and living their lives and relatively comfortable. Yeah.
Just to note, these two pieces were in the BYU Museum of Art in that home exhibit.
Ah.
Just that
Recently?
a couple months ago, I saw these like.
Ah, awesome. Did they also have ones from her more recent series? Because she's. Okay, because she's made them more recently about American interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it is one of the things that starts to stand out looking at those more recent ones. With these ones, it's the domestic sphere, and with the more recent ones, she's drawing connections between like the world of fashion and commodity culture and the sort of horrors of war. And it's like I've noticed at a certain point, she's really kind of coming down hard on women. American women who were at home and comfortable and enjoying the sort of decadence and pleasures of a domestic lifestyle or of shopping while this is going on. I don't think it's intentional on her part. I think it's just the imagery that was around at the time. But the politics of gender in these works are pretty interesting. Okay, so the next image you may be familiar with, but it's a little rough. Just a heads up, it's difficult. So this is a poster that the Art Workers Coalition made. They made thousands of them and put them up all over the place. And they used a photograph that was taken at My Lai by an American at My Lai, who he was the official photographer, and he had his official black and white camera, and then he had his own color camera. And he took pictures, and then he made them public when he came home. He provided them to news magazines, and it was Life magazine. And the text, question and babies, answer and babies, is from an interview that Mike Wallace, so you guys know Mike Wallace, old news guy, he did an interview with another one of the men who was present for the My Lai massacre and participated in the My Lai massacre, Paul Meadlow. And Meadlow said, you know, we killed everyone in this village, everyone. And Wallace asked him, and babies? And he said, and babies, right? So this interview was a real turning point. These photographs in this interview were a real turning point in the war. This is where that sort of the history of World War II, the atrocities of the Germans, suddenly began to sort of shift in terms of American self-perception. These are piles of bodies of women and children and babies. And there were further details in these interviews that came out that were really horribly distressing. And so they took this question in this photograph and they put it everywhere, right? And their goal is to ask Americans to say, no, we don't want to be doing this. We want out of this particular conflict. We're worried that we're becoming the bad guys. We need to get out. And so this is the social and sort of intellectual and discursive world in which she makes this work, right? So Mai Lin's memorial, its sort of apolitical nature, is compared to works such as the Art Workers Coalition poster, which really pull no punches. So this idea it can't be political, I don't think that necessarily means it can't have representation. And there is another work that was introduced to sort of go with this for people who wanted something more figurative. Yeah.
Was that part of her?
No. She wanted nothing to do. Let me find them. Here they are. She wanted nothing to do with this. And initially, the people who proposed this wanted to put it like at the top, like it was going to go here. Can you see my arrow? Anyway, right here. It's going to go right there. And she and the sort of committee behind this were like, no. So why the resistance, do you think, to the figurative component? Which I understand is sort of off to the side somewhere. Huh.
But these more or less depend on her and glorified, and I think so many people, so many of them, know about this. They didn't want that.
Right.
And it was a grieving thing, it was for our nation.
I think also this, I mean, while this is stylistically is fairly modern, in particular in terms of the appearance of the figures, the idea of sort of like three men standing together, that comes from a really long tradition of figurative sculpture that does glorify warfare and valor and martial honor and all of those things. And I think it was really important that this memorial neither seek to shame or to valorize actions of violence. Instead, it's like we have suffered a terrible, terrible loss. And this is here to help us remember it and think about it and be contemplative in our relationship to it.
I think it was also kind of the conflict between, you have each of the names, so each one of those individual men get on the wall, and then these become kind of just these generic representations of random soldiers. So
Yeah.
who are they? Or did we pick three to say we're more? It does seem kind of a weird.
Well, these kinds of representations do tend, unless they're of a specific, like, great leader, the sort of the unknown soldier, right? This sort of nameless, generic figure that is supposed to be accessible to and represent everybody. But I think there was an understanding that for many people, that was not going to work. They didn't want, veterans who had survived didn't necessarily want to look at themselves in that way. They didn't want to look at themselves still in uniform, still carrying weapons. Some did, certainly. But for many, I think this sense of being able to go to the wall and mourn and sort of see their actual current, present reflection
So if
instead
they're-
was.
It's all 2 years apart?
That sounds.
It says 82 for her,
Uh-huh.
but that's what I wondered is if
Yeah.
it was all like unveiled and installed and open.
This was a
together?
response. It was a way to
Oh, so this
deal
is
with
way
the
to make everybody
controversy.
that was mad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Conciliatory. I wanted to ask you guys to compare these as monuments or memorials. Well, I didn't really come up with it. The committee, the AP committee did. But they do look pretty good together. I mean, what does it mean to make a monument these days? How has our attitude towards the memorial or monument changed? So we're less likely to sort of celebrate and valorize power the way that we perhaps historically have done. Where do you think that comes from? How did we go from a culture that celebrates those in power in its art to a culture that actively sort of refuses that sort of representational culture?